Welcome. This is the sophomore video for PTD Gaming. Thanks for being here. And yes, I know. It is another class guide. What can I say? I love class guides. I love watching them. I love all the different content creators out there, and it's one of the reasons that I actually started doing this myself. I want to give it a shot. But one thing I noticed when I finished up my first video on the Banner Spear, that sucker was long. And when I looked at other class guides that are out there on YouTube, most of them are pretty long, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, even more in some cases. Now, while I love that long content, and I definitely will eat it up, I know that maybe not everybody's looking for that all the time. So I thought I would try something a little bit different in my second video here. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to boil it down. I'm just going to play the highlights, play the hits. Get you up and running on a class, give you all the things that you need to know without going through every card and every detail, every perk and every detail. So this isn't going to have everything about the class, but it should have more than enough to get you up and running, give you an understanding of how the class plays and what you should look for, and also help you make your own decisions as you progress with the Meteor from Frosthaven. So the last thing I should get out of the way here, if you didn't realize this already, there will be spoilers for a locked class here, right? After this point, we're starting to use names. We're going to look at actual cards. If you don't want to know anything about this locked class, turn it off now. But without further ado, let's get on to it. The bite-sized Meteor guide. Let's start with the basics. Here's a look at the character card for the Savas Pyroclast. So you have a 10 card hand size, which is basically pretty average. You can use some lost cards here or there. You don't want to be crazy with them. And the Meteor does actually have some pretty good lost cards that you'll be able to utilize at some point. You start with 9 hit points, so it's on the medium level hit point scale. It goes up 1 hit point and then 2 hit points on alternating levels. I think it's the same track the Blink Blade is on, for instance. If you get all the way to level 9, you have a whole 20 hit points. So, that stuff aside, what matters? What's fun about this class? What makes it different? Well, what makes it different is hazardous terrain manipulation. So the way the Savas Pyroclast works is that you have a lot of ways to create and manipulate hazardous terrain on the map. Now you can also manipulate obstacles to some degree, but really, in my estimation, the best way to play this class is to really hone in and focus on the hazardous terrain. That's where you're going to do your most damage. So when you create hazardous terrain, you can create it in any featureless hex on the map. So if you don't already know what a featureless hex is, it basically boils down to any hex on the map that doesn't have an overlay tile on it. So overlay tiles being things like obstacles is an overlay tile, a trap is an overlay tile, for instance. Something like a loot token, though, is not an overlay tile because that's just sort of a temporary thing that sits there, right? So any featureless hex, you can put most of your hazardous terrain in. So that means you can even put it on a tile that already has an enemy in it, which is cool. Although I would note that when you do that, in most cases, those enemies don't suffer any damage from the hazardous terrain. The way hazardous terrain works is you only suffer damage when you enter the hex. So even though you're creating hazardous terrain under an enemy, they don't suffer damage from it unless the card specifically says that they do. And you do have some cards that do that. So your character card also has a handy little chart for you that tells you exactly how much damage these hazardous terrain tiles do depending on the difficulty of the scenario. For the most part, you're talking about 2 or 3 damage. You have to get up pretty high on the chart to get up to 4 damage or even more. So for the most part, I only played it with about 3 damage. I don't think we ever got to a scenario difficulty where we're doing 4 damage. Just the way the nature of Frosthaven works, how you have characters leaving and starting over at lower levels and things of that nature. The other thing I want to briefly mention here about the Pyroclast and how it works, you do also have quite a few cards that allow you to manipulate enemy position, meaning pulls or pushes or things of that nature. So you have a lot of ways that you can take advantage of your hazardous terrain by pushing or pulling enemies into it, through it, maybe through multiple pieces of hazardous terrain or whatnot. So you can do a lot of cool things with that. The other thing to remember about hazardous terrain is that it also allows you to zone off enemies, because enemy movement, they will be reluctant to move into hazardous terrain unless they absolutely have to in order to attack their focus, right? That's the only time they will do it. Otherwise, they will generally walk around it if they can. So that helps control exactly where enemies are on the map and how they get to your party, which can be great. The last thing that I would mention is there is a limit. You can only have 6 hazardous terrain tiles that you create out on the map at the same time. Now, other characters also create hazardous terrain, and you will also get similar bonuses from their hazardous terrain as yours, but you personally can only create 6 different hexes of it. Now, that doesn't mean that you just can't create it anymore after you have 6 out, but at that point you have to remove old ones in order to create new ones, but you can do that in any way you see fit. You can remove any tile of hazardous terrain that you created in order to move it or create a new one somewhere else. Now let's take a quick look at the back of the card just for some other details there. It lists a complexity of 3, which is interesting to me. In my last video we talked about the banner spear, which had a complexity of 2 from the back of the card, but I thought that was not exactly right. I felt it was actually easier to get more out of the meteor than it was to get out of the banner spear. Just the way the class plays, there's more easy ways to do damage. Yes, you have to wrap your head around dealing with hazardous terrain a little bit, but it's not something that's overly complex. You've dealt with it before in most cases within Frosthaven or Gloomhaven before, so it's not like it's a totally new concept to you. The new concept is just your ability to manipulate it the way you can with the Pyroclast. As far as what its different strengths and weaknesses are as they're listed on the back of the card here, it is a very strong melee attacker, and that's where I did most of my damage when playing the class, is up close and personal. It does have some ranged attacks and actually some few very interesting ones that are very helpful for you, but really I focus more on melee attacks to get the most damage out of this class. You don't have any support to speak of. You don't really have ways to help your allies very much, if at all. Nothing that I can even remember off the top of my head right now. And you definitely do have quite a bit of control, like I mentioned already. Just your ability to zone off enemies and the different things you can do to manipulate their locations is huge and can be really helpful to your party. The last thing that I want to mention here, it does mention that there's its defense is actually not just very low, it's actually pretty decent, and it is. You're not a high armor class or anything like that, but you do have some cards that will give you armor, shield, and retaliate. And there is even, if you get later on in later levels with the Pyroclast, there is even a way to play it fairly tanky as you add more cards that can improve your defensive capabilities. I personally never did that, so I'm not going to talk about that within this video. We're just going to focus on the hazardous terrain creating damage dealing meteor that I played. The last thing here before we move on to some actual cards, you do generate quite a bit of fire and earth with this character from your different cards and abilities. You do also have lots of ways to use those elements, which is great. I would say you should emphasize the fire aspect of that quite a bit more. That's the element that you generate most often when you're generating hazardous terrain, and it's also the element that you can use most often to enhance those variabilities. There are a few things you can do with earth if you get it, but I didn't focus on that nearly as much as being able to use fire as often as possible. Okay, let's talk cards for the Pyroclast. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'm not going to go through every card in every detail. I'm going to try to give you the highlights. So what you see here is the first 4 core cards of the class that you're going to be able to use at level 1. These are the cards that I use the most often. These are the cards that I felt like I got the most value out of when I was playing the class, at least at the very beginning. The first card here is a Lava Bomb. It's an attack 2, range 3, and you get to create a hazardous terrain tile in the featureless hex of that target. So basically you target an enemy who's in a featureless hex, so he's not standing on a trap or he's not standing on an obstacle or anything like that. You do 2 damage to him, and then you also generate hazardous terrain right under him. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, that figure will not take damage from that attack at that point. But you do have other cards, in fact one that we'll talk about that's on here in just a minute, where you actually get bonuses for attacks dealt against characters or figures that are standing in hazardous terrain. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. It also generates fire, and the bottom is a move 4. Really, really solid card. Usually the very first card I played every scenario. Okay, the next card here is Igneous Path. Very complicated top and very complicated bottom, but both pretty cool. First, the top is a loss, as you will see here, so keep that in mind. It also doesn't automatically generate XP as a loss, but in just a second we'll see that you can actually get quite a bit of XP from this if done right. So here you basically designate a featureless hex within range 4. Again, featureless, let's remember that. Featureless is very important for this class. And you create a path to it of hazardous terrain, basically. So a path of 4 hexes to that every featureless hex with, in that path gets a hazardous terrain tile placed on it. Even if figures are there, again, if enemies are there, you can place the hazardous terrain right under them. And enemies that are in that created hazardous terrain from this ability will actually suffer 3 damage from the hazardous terrain, which is usually better because you're usually talking about 2 base damage from hazardous terrain. And you'll also get 1 experience point for each enemy that is damaged in that way. So if you happen to be able to line this up exactly right in maybe a very full, end of scenario room or something like that, you can get up to 4 experience from this loss action, which is pretty good. It is also a great initiative. Well, I say great, but very, very good initiative. For the bottom here, it's only a move 1 at its base, which you're not going to use it for that very often. You're usually going to use that bottom if there's fire available, because what you can do is if you burn the fire, you get to make that a move 2, and then each featureless hex you leave with this movement, the featureless hex you leave, so you start in 1 hex, you go to 1 hex and then another hex, those 2 hexes, if they're featureless, now have hazardous terrain in them as well. This is also a good card to use if you happen to have maybe boots that increase your movement or some other way where you're going to be able to increase your movement for the turn. You can get quite a lot of value out of creating quite a bit of hazardous terrain out of this. I even in one scenario was able to kind of run a little ring around a guy and just surround him with hazardous terrain, which was very fun at the time. It's a very strong card. It is a little bit harder to use overall because that is a top burn and that bottom is a little situational, but when you can use it, it's really, really good. Okay, Flowing Fire. At its base, this is only an attack 2, but it does have a pretty good sort of formation that you can attack within there. But the cool part of this is if you have fire to burn. Again, like I mentioned earlier, fire is really good. Like the last card and this card can both use fire to good effect. If you burn fire, you can create hazardous terrain again in any of the empty red hexes of this attack ability. So basically you can maybe attack 1 guy for 2 and then also add 2 hazardous terrain tiles behind him theoretically. And then you can use some of your manipulation effects to move them around and do more damage in that turn potentially. Now the bottom of Flowing Fire is very important. The bottom here is a move 6, which sounds fantastic. But this is where we get into one of the first things that I didn't mention earlier during the overview of the class. The Pirate class has a lot of abilities that have mandatory persistent bonuses, and this is one example. You can see that it's a move 6, but then now at the start of your next 2 turns, you're going to have to take a damage. And the thing is like a lot of characters have persistent bonuses like this, like the Drifter, for instance, but they can basically choose to dismiss those things at any time if they want to. With the Pyro class, you can't do that. If you have a persistent bonus like this one, which is really not a persistent bonus, it's a persistent negative in this case, you have to keep it out until it goes away, basically, until those 3 turns are up. The only exception is that if you perform any kind of rest, you can dismiss these kind of abilities. Now you do also have like 1 or 2 cards that let you to move the token on abilities like this, but not a ton of them. Not like the Drifter has, where they're kind of all over the class, but you do have a couple different ways that you can move character tokens a little bit on cards like this. But you have more cards like this that you'll see as you play the class. So the last of our core cards here is Melted Armor. So Melted Armor is really our first sort of big attack card here, but it's a really important one. I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of attacks and abilities that benefit from the target or you being in hazardous terrain. So in this case, if the enemy is in hazardous terrain, it gets a bonus effect. So it's a base attack 3, but if they're in hazardous terrain, you get +1 attack and Pierce 3 and generate an experience. So that's an attack 4, Pierce 3 with an experience, non-loss, that also generates fire if they are in hazardous terrain. That's a lot for a non-loss top of a card, which is why they have to be in hazardous terrain for it to work. And the bottom is another one of those persistent abilities, and this one has like some good and some bad in it for sure. So the very first thing you'll notice here is that all attacks targeting you add +1 attack to their attacks. This, I'm not gonna lie, this can be bad. Don't use this card if you're surrounded, for instance, and you're gonna be taking 3 or 4 attacks. That's a sure way to end your scenario early, for sure. But if you're maybe far away from stuff and you're not in any danger of being attacked, okay, this might be worth putting out, because the one benefit of it, as you can see, is on your next 3 attacks, you get +1 to your attack as well. So that's a decent bonus. It's not a huge bonus, but again, this is one of those mandatory persistent abilities, so you can't just dismiss it. You can only get rid of it either by going all through those 3 attacks that you perform, or by performing a short or a long rest, okay? Okay, the next set of cards I'm going to talk about are all move manipulation cards. Like I mentioned before, I'm not going to go through every card here, but here are the next 3 that I will go over in some detail. The first one here, Liquid Stone, is an attack 3 with a push 2. That's a great one if you have hazardous terrain in the right places. You could theoretically push them through 2 hazardous terrain tiles, which is potentially an additional 4 or maybe even 6 damage in some cases beyond the 3 damage that it already starts with. So pretty strong top action. The other thing I would note about this card, and actually all 3 of these here, is they all have enhancement spots in pretty useful areas. Now the first one here, this attack 3 push 2, it can enhance both the push. It can make the push further with a +1. It can also enhance the attack 3 itself by making it have a negative condition applied as well. So you can turn this into an attack 3 with poison push 2, for instance, which makes it an even better card than it already is. The bottom of this card is one of my favorite bottoms throughout the entire class. It's a move 3, but you also then get to push an enemy that's right next to you 1. So this is great when you've set up some hazardous terrain. Like, if you remember some of the other ones that we showed, you can set up hazardous terrain sort of at a distance, and then you can do this bottom action to then move and then push that enemy through the hazardous terrain you just created, which is a pretty cool interaction, can be for sure. The other thing here is that it does give you the opportunity to burn earth, which adds 2 to that push and makes it a push 3. So if you have a really good set of hazardous terrain, you could do some serious damage with the bottom action of this card, which can be fun. And actually, honestly, the way that I played this card, it was a lot of putting out hazardous terrain, pushing and pulling enemies around. It just made it a lot of fun to play, especially coming from the Banner Spear first, which, I did say in the video, the Banner Spear was fun, but the Meteor or the Pyroclast was fun right away, right out of the gate. And it's because of things like this. Next one here, Force of the Earth, another move manipulation card. In this case, we're talking about an attack 1 at range 3. In this case, you get to pull the target 2, and it muddles them. It's also a very strong initiative, so another example of a good manipulation card to pull people through hazardous terrain. That's what we're doing here. That's our job. Pull them through, push them through hazardous terrain. The bottom of this card, I have to admit, I don't think I ever use this to any effectiveness, but I could see where theoretically it could be. It might just be because in the party that I was in, there wasn't a ton of healing going around, so it wasn't like I was getting healing often enough to take advantage of the bonuses you get from this. But there are scenarios where you can definitely take advantage of this for sure. It just didn't work out for me personally when I played the class. But you destroy any adjacent obstacle, and if you do, the next heals targeting you get a +3 to that heal. So that's pretty strong overall, for sure. If you can make it work. But again, it just didn't work out for me. And the last card here for forced movement, Quenched Rage. Push 3. Just push 3. No attack, no nothing. And the other thing is that if you burn earth and you push them through hazardous terrain, it will double the damage they take from any hazardous terrain that they are pushed through as a result of this particular ability. That's pretty strong. You can make 2 damage hazardous terrains 4 damage for the purposes of this card. The sort of rub here though is that after you do that, it turns that hazardous terrain into obstacles, which I think is why they call it Quenched Rage, because it turns this fiery hazardous terrain into cool rock or something instead. So you do lose the ability to use that hazardous terrain after that point, which can be kind of a bummer, but in a lot of cases, it's fine if you're about to move on to another room or you're ready to create more in any case. The bottom, another mandatory persistent ability with some negative consequences. In this one, on your next 3 attacks, you get -1 to your attack, but then that 4th attack, you get to double the value of the attack. So for that 4th attack, you better be ready with something good. It can be used, it can be effective, but I just didn't like dealing with those -1s on the other attacks. You have to be ready to really take advantage of this card. Preferably be ready with something that maybe you're going to be able to attack multiple people with smaller attacks anyway or something like that, or just being able to account for those -1s and then really be ready for that last attack. You do have a lot of big attacks with this one, just like that, you know, that attack 4 that we looked at before. Attack 4, Pierce 3 if they're in hazardous terrain. You can make that an attack 8 with this card. That's pretty strong, and that will make up for the -1 that you lost to get there. Okay, here's a look at my suggested build for level 1. But the thing that I would say here that I want to emphasize in a video like this is I just want to give you the basics and let you decide what's best for you. You might want a couple different cards differently than I have here, and that's totally fair. There's also a good chance that you're starting this class beyond level 1, especially because this is a locked class that you won't get right away at the very beginning from starting in Frosthaven. So I figure there's a fair to middling chance you're starting at least level 2 when you pick up this class potentially. I know that I did. But in any case, if I was starting this at level 1, this is what I would take. Again, I'm not going to go into every card in detail here, but there are a couple that I want to talk about a little bit in here that we didn't talk about already. The first one I'm going to talk about is cooling. And first I'm going to talk about the bottom and not the top. You do potentially run into a fair amount of self-damage with this class from your mandatory persistent abilities, also from hazardous terrain before you get a certain perk that we'll talk about in a few minutes here. So having some self-healing capabilities can be really important. The other thing is that you are a strong melee class, but you don't have tank hit points. So a lot of times you can find yourself in dicey situations if you're not careful. So it's just helpful to have a healing around. So with this card, with that bottom, you get a healing of 5. But the problem is after that, because you've cooled yourself down to heal yourself, you're moving much slower. So you have -1 move to your next 3 moves. Again, mandatory, but you can dismiss it through short resting or long resting if you really need to get rid of that movement penalty. As far as the top of this card, you replace a 1 hex hazardous terrain tile within range 4, unoccupied hex, an unoccupied hex, so it can't have an enemy in it. But an unoccupied hazardous terrain tile within range 4, you can replace that with an objective, or not an objective, I'm sorry, an obstacle. And then any enemies that are adjacent to that obstacle that you just created will suffer 2 damage. So in an ideal, perfect Fantasyland world of Frosthaven, yes, you could theoretically deal out 2 damage, unmitigatable, through shields, 2 damage to 6 enemies all at once. But you know how likely that is to happen if you play this game at all. But still, if you can get 2 people with this, that is a pretty decent use of the top action here. It does also generate earth for you, which can be useful in some cases, and also generates an experience. The other card I want to talk about here really quickly is Eruption. First, the bottom is an attack 2, which is just great to have an attack 2, easy attack 2 available to you as a bottom action occasionally if you don't need to move. So that's good. The top half is a really interesting loss card. It can be really beneficial, again, if things fall just right the way that things are set up. So let's look at it. You create 1 hex obstacle tile with an empty hex within range 5. So it's a good range 5, but it's got to be an empty hex. And then you create 1 hex hazardous terrain tiles in adjacent hexes that are occupied from that attack. So what that means is that if there's an empty hex and it has multiple monsters surrounding that empty hex, you create an obstacle there, and then every featureless hex that has an enemy in it will then get a hazardous terrain in that, right on top of that enemy, and they will also suffer 4 damage in this case. So this is definitely a last room kind of perfect scenario. I'm going to blow up a bunch of guys at once sort of attack. It can be fun. You do generate fire and earth from this, but again, it is a loss. You do gain 2 experience from it. Don't use it if you're only going to attack 1 guy with it, unless it's, the tail end of the scenario and it doesn't matter. But if it sets up right, this can be a really fun blow up a whole bunch of guys with an eruption of magma. Okay, to wrap up the kind of card section, because again, I'm not going through everything, but let's take a look at your level 2 cards, because like I said, there's a good chance that you're starting at level 2 already, but if you're not, you're probably not far away. We'll just talk about the choice here just as like to set up an idea of like how you might want to choose what cards to take as the Pyroclast. So first let's talk about Deep Fury here. In this case, this top action is an action that is better if you are occupying Hazardous Terrain for the action. So what happens is it's a base attack 3 if you are not occupying Hazardous Terrain, but if you are in Hazardous Terrain, it turns it into an attack 4 with push 2 and an experience, which is already pretty darn good, especially if there's other Hazardous Terrain that you can then push that enemy into. So that's good, but you also then get to heal yourself for 2 as part of this action, and it's not a loss. So that's a lot to get out of one card if you happen to be in Hazardous Terrain. And there are lots of opportunities to be in that very situation. The bottom is a little simpler, but it can do a lot. It's a heal 3, first of all, but then you put it out as a persistent ability and it will be lost after this persistent ability triggers. On your next attack, targeting an enemy who is occupying Hazardous Terrain, you get to double the value of that attack. So if you could somehow figure out how to line up, if you remember one of the other bottoms, the final attack, you got to double the value of your attack, and then get this at this, like, you could do some crazy, crazy stuff if you can figure out how to do all the math and make it all triangulate into a point where you double and then double the value of an attack. And if you're doing that, please, for the love of God, have advantage, have some way to give yourself advantage so you don't do that. And then your other option at level 2 is Searing Smoke, and we're going to start with the bottom of this card. Move forward with jump. That's just a solid move card to have available. There are no other move abilities that have given you jump thus far. So this is really nice and handy if you're like having an enemy right in front of you, but you have Hazardous Terrain behind you. You want to get behind them and then push them through that Hazardous Terrain, something to that effect. This is the kind of card you need to make that happen. And then also any enemy that you move through with this move ability also gets Muddle. So already this is a really strong card just on that bottom. The top of Searing Smoke is very situational. And this one you do an attack 2, target all adjacent enemies. So if you're surrounded, this is great. But who wants to be surrounded? You don't want to be in that situation. But if you were, you could do an attack 2 on all the enemies surrounding you. If you burn fire, it makes an attack 3 and gives you an experience. If you then also burn earth, it also causes Muddle and gives you another experience. So if you have fire and earth to burn, you can do an attack 2 on all adjacent enemies, or attack 3 on all adjacent enemies with 2 experience and Muddle. That's pretty darn solid if you can get all those things, again, to triangulate. But that's always the difficulty in Frosthaven, is getting all these things to work together in just the right way to get the most value out of the card. So, what did I take? That doesn't really matter, does it? This is for you. What are you going to take? What do you like about these two? Though I will admit that I actually took the first card here. I was drawn in by that heal ability of that top action, and I love the idea of being able to attack people from Hazardous Terrain. Again, if you remember from my Banner Spear video, there are choices I made that were based on what I felt about the character and what it was. And it's a similar situation here. When I think about the Meteor, I look at his character art. He's like based on that Hazardous Terrain, and the idea of him attacking from within Hazardous Terrain and doing more damage because of it just felt really, really cool to me from an RP sort of perspective. And that's the card that I went with. So let's talk about perks here real quick. Again, I'm not getting into all of them. I'm not getting into grand detail, but I'll hit some highlights that I think are important. One, you do have an Ignore Scenario Effects perk. That's always one that's good to take. Definitely one of the early perks that you want to take. But even before you take that, there's one perk that I seriously recommend you focus on immediately. That's at the very bottom of your list here. This costs you 3 perk slots to activate, but when you do, it makes you and your allies immune to your Hazardous Terrain damage. Hugely, hugely important to make the class easier to play. You know, remember this affects not only the other characters that are with you, but their summons and things of that nature. So it makes it a lot easier to play the class, where then you can just focus on doing what you need to do, put out as much Hazardous Terrain as you want, wherever you want to do it, without having to worry about how it might negatively impact the other people in your party. So do that first. So there you go. That's it. That's all I'm giving you. That's the end of this bite-sized Meteor class guide. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got some good information out of it. If you have additional questions, feel free to leave comments and I can answer there. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, yada, yada, yada. You've been here, you've done this, you know what's going on. I hope you enjoyed this video and look for more content like this from me in the future. Thanks.